All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. This week we are moving into labeling theory, the application of labeling theory to thinking about the individual experience. How do people experience stigma? How do people experience being labeled as being deviant? And then thinking about a little bit about the audience response as well. So I'm trying to kind of retrack kind of where we've been so far in the course of the term, just to kind of get you into the space of thinking about like why include this particular topic area, this particular subject. So we started off the term just a little bit about sociology, sociological perspective on deviance. We differentiated between positivism and constructionism. And then we went through a lot of the positivist theories, things like differential association, Hershey's control theory, Merton's strain theory, all these positivist theories, like measuring what are the causes of deviance or motivating factors that's increasing people's likelihood to commit deviance or criminal activity. And now we're kind of focused on, with this week, with chapter 5 and chapter 6, focused on what happens when individuals are labeled as being deviant or criminal. For example, a status of being a felon, of being somebody who's been formally convicted, somebody who's been formally incarcerated. Like these labels, what's the impact of the labels themselves, and how do people navigate and negotiate around this labeling process? Labeling and stigma can be very problematic, can be very difficult, can be very challenging, also could be very functional in some sort of way as well. But now we're kind of, with this section, we're moving into thinking about the labeling process and the impact of labels on individuals. Still could be a very positivist approach for sure, because measuring kind of impact, measuring influence, measuring how people navigate the labeling process. So here, we're going from the macro to more of a micro individual level kind of perspective. So as I mentioned, we covered all these different theories before. Now we're moving a little bit different perspective. The theories that of these theories, like of differential association, Hershey's control theory, those two in particular are social learning theories, like how do people learn um, motivations and rationalizations, what's going on in terms of their connections with others that might influence degrees of deviance or criminality. Those are like those social learning theories were more micro level, because looking at how individuals within a social setting, how they learn motivations, dispositions, attitudes that encourage or discourage involvement in deviance or crime. Similar here with social learning, but we're focused on labeling yeah, similar focus of looking at the group and the influence of the group, but we're focused on the actual labels themselves, the stigma, and how people navigate that. And then this week and next, we're in this sort of individual level experience. Okay, so let's kind of let me provide a little bit of background to get to where we need to be. So, as far as what this labeling theory and how to sort of think about it and unpack it, I think a good place to start is the University of Chicago in the 1960s, called the Chicago School of Sociology. And it was during that time period where some researchers, some theorists shifted the focus from predominantly macro level ideas within sociology and moved them to thinking about the micro level, looking at groups, looking at smaller units, looking at individuals, and shifting the focus away from just structures and institutions and moving to the micro level. So examination of deviance shifted to include the individual and group analysis and the relationship between individuals, groups, and larger systems of social control. Howard Becker, probably the most well-known for his work in addressing this more micro level kind of analysis in a book called Outsiders. It's a quote from the book that social groups create deviance by making the rules. So deviance is created when a group creates the rules whose infraction, when somebody goes against those rules, when that's marked as being deviant, And then by applying those rules to particular people and then labeling them as outsiders, labeling them as others, labeling them as others as non-conforming. So you notice here that it's a process, right, of rules being made and then rules being enforced and those rules being applied to certain individuals or groups. Deviance is a consequence of labeling something as deviant and responding to it. So, if I go back to some of those ideas that we might have about like biological theories of criminality, for example, puts thinking about like violent crime and says, okay, well, violent crime, what's going on in internal motivations that increase person's likelihood for violent crime. Now we're thinking about this issue that what does culture, what do groups define as being deviant or criminal? And then how do people and communities respond to it when people break that rule or make an infraction? So it's shifting to this sort of focus on the label versus focused on understanding individual dispositions and motivations and things like that. I think it's kind of insightful. I remember the first time I read Becker's Outsiders, it's like, wow, it's kind of interesting. Never really thought about this stuff before. So it's like, well, it's just kind of a different way of looking at things and thinking about labeling. It's when he makes this distinction between the four different types of behavior. Conforming behavior, where there's a rule, people follow the rule, that's conforming. Then there's individuals who are purely deviant, what Becker would define as purely deviant, that there's a rule, people break the individuals, they break that rule and they're upfront about it. They're not trying to hide that, or at least they'll come clean with about that. I mean, they're pure, they're what he would call a pure deviant. Then there's a secret deviant, individuals who commit acts of deviance or crime, but they keep it hidden from others. And in part, keeping it hidden from others because they're worried about the consequences, which could include very formal consequences, loss of a job, incarceration, or it could be very informal, stigma, loss of respect from peer groups and family members and things like that. And then there's falsely accused deviant, which is super fascinating. This is one that fascinated me when I first read Becker's work, is that what happens when people are falsely accused, like they actually did not commit an act of deviance or crime and they're falsely accused of something. Here we can study and look at the impact of labels and responses from the audience and its impact on the individual in a really pure way, because now we kind of get to the issue of the person didn't do anything, they're falsely accused, they've been labeled, identified. So how do we think through the impact of the label, and we can understand how people navigate that. I think one study I remember reading a long time ago, 20 years ago. Yeah, I guess that's been 30 years ago now. Um, Women athletes in certain sports, sometimes falsely accused as being as lesbian, and how they manage that lesbian stigma. Um, at least at that time period, I'm sure it's probably still, some of this is still true and still some stigmatization, although I'm sure it's declined over 30 years. Well, I know it's declined over 30 years, but just interesting kind of an examination of interviewing, talking with female athletes who've been falsely accused and how they address that association because they are a softball player or a particular sport. They're falsely accused as being deviant. So how do they manage that deviant identity, that potential deviant identity? And they do it through a lot of different mechanisms. So even though people are not engaged in a particular behavior that may be identified as deviant, people may be falsely accused. They may be fearing they're going to be falsely accused, and may start to navigate it as a result of that. So that's kind of like a foundational overview of sort of the idea of like where we're going to get at with, Becker help facilitate is focused on understanding the process of something becoming defined as deviant, the labels themselves, and then the audience response, and then how people navigate stigmatization. Okay, let's now move to different theories of the self, which I think are really important and really essential to kind of get into this space. We'll start off with Charles Cooley and the Looking Glass Self. There's some great videos out there, tutorials on Cooley and Mead, if you want to check them out. Just 5-minute videos, Looking Glass Self, Mead's ideas on the development of self, Mead and I and Me. We'll give you some good overviews of these different theories as well as Goffman's dramaturgy. So to start with Cooley and Mead were contemporaries. They were writing about the same time. They have very similar ideas about the development of self, although there's definitely differences between the two. But they see that the self is a social process. So the self, we don't emerge from the womb with a sense of self, but we develop a sense of self and we navigate that self throughout the course of our lives. Cooley had this idea that we have a look at, we form a sense of self based on how we imagine other people see us, what we imagine, what we interpret the judgment others are providing to us, and what meaning we make of that. So kind of walk through that again. So how I imagine somebody else might see me, my interpretation of how they might judge me, and the meaning I assign to that judgment. And Cooley's belief was that through every interaction in our lifespan, that's how we have developed our sense of who we are, our sense of self is through that reflective thing that's going on, and that we're imagining how other people might see us, and we imagine people's judgment of us, and then we're trying to determine, assess things like, well, how do I address that judgment? Do I care about that judgment? I mean, how am I going to respond to that? And that this is a fundamental aspect of formation of self. Now, we may not always consciously do this like in a day-to-day environment, the people we interact with, but it is a pretty profound way of thinking about the development of self. If you're familiar with feral children who've been unsocialized or not around a lot of human contact, that the self breaks down. That thing, we need to be in a social environment around others, and it's a fundamental part of formation of self. This is why solitary confinement seen as cruel and unusual punishment, because it leads to a mortification of the self, breakdown of the self, and psychological problems. Was there the issue? I was going to bring up the movie Castaway, if you've ever seen it, with Tom Hanks, and he's stranded on an island and no one's there, just him. So he creates this friend, a volleyball, and he names the ball, and the volleyball was manufactured by Wilson Company. So Wilson becomes his friend. I mean, he needs that looking glass self to keep and maintain an idea of self. Well, how this is going to be related to deviance is that if an individual has been assigned a deviant status, they've been stigmatized, they're imagining how other people might see them, the judgment other people might be providing them. And this is where we start to get into the impact of that label on self. So if a person has an addiction, a physical addiction, they're addicted to heroin, addicted to some substance that's viewed as deviant and criminal in society, even though other individuals, like they could be a secret deviant, even though individuals may not know they're actively having an addiction, this becomes part of what they imagine other people might see them. And they imagine if people were aware, if they engaged in this behavior, the judgment that may be applied to them, and people maybe, they're navigating that particular space. So that's kind of looking glass self. Mead had a little bit different perspective. Mead's idea was still, it's about the self is developed in a social environment. Everything is learned. For Mead, he's what's called a behaviorist, that all behavior is learned in a social environment. He makes a distinction, I think, he has this idea that we think before we act, and that's a really important part. And what we're thinking about is we take the role of other. This becomes similar to Cooley, right? Taking the role, imagining how other people might see us. So taking the role of other, and when we're our earlier stages of development, we take the role of specific others. So wondering about how our mother or our father or caretaker or family members or brother, sister, or teacher, like take the role of specific others and imagine how those specific others might see us, or how they might judge a particular action, behavior, or something. Okay, so that's specific other. Let me back up for a moment and get into the I and the me. The I is the part of ourself that's the subjective self. So it's the sense of self when there's not a lot of focus on thinking about how other people might, there's not a lot going on about taking the role of others. So a person's at home, they're in an environment where there's no one else around them. They're not even thinking about other people. They're in a more of an what Mead would call state as an I. This is part of their I. The me is when people are the object, when they know they're being observed. So the objectification of women, you hear that term objectification, it comes from this idea of being an object. So when people know that they are an object, then they're conscious and aware how other people may be seeing them and maybe judging them and maybe looking at them. And there's this navigation for Mead going on between the subjective self, the I, and the objective self, and this interplay that's always going on in our lives. And this is the formation of self. So using that as a framework, we take the role of other. Now we're moving, when we're in that space, we are fully in the me much more so. We have this we have the sense of I, sense of self that's away from that space of thinking about how others may see us. But we're in that me space, we're fully into that, taking the role of other. And when we're young, it's the specific other. And we do this, I mean, it's not just when we're young, but the first stage of development, it's specific other. And then a little bit later on in our development, we also incorporate what's called the generalized other, where we develop an understanding of societal and cultural expectations. And no longer is it taking on just the role of specific other, but now it's the understanding of larger cultural, social norms, values, ideas, all these different kind of things. And this becomes part of the formation of self. So the idea of the generalized other, knowing that engaging in prostitution or soliciting the services of a prostitute. It doesn't have to necessarily be taking the role of a specific other now. Now it's like the generalized other. People are aware of society's expectations, aware that the stigma attached to that or the labeling that may follow of being involved in sex work or soliciting the services from a sex worker. This becomes this part of the generalized other of thinking about the audience. So Goffman and stigma. So Goffman is a theorist who has an idea. It's called, well, it focuses on the interaction ritual. He studied the very micro level, like what are some of the ritualistic behaviors that go along with interactions? And he had an idea that humans are fundamentally concerned about, focused on impression management. I mean, we are social creatures, social belonging and connection is really important for our sense of self, for our sense of identity, for our mental health. It's who we are. We are social creatures, and we are engaged in the process of impression management. The groups that we belong to, that we will we will provide presentation of self in ways that's managing an impression. And so it's this idea of dramaturgy. So life is like a theater. We play a role. We have a script. We have a costume. We have a dress. There's a setting. There's an audience. We're performing for an audience. We adjust our performance based on audience expectations. This isn't a fake sense of who we are. This becomes, I think, an incredibly important part to keep in mind with Goffman is that Goffman, sees that we are managing impressions in all environments. And some environments, of course, it's going to take on different levels of consciousness and awareness about that, but we are managing impressions. And it's a necessary part of what we do. And it's not that we are necessarily like chameleons, maybe in part, but it's like we're adjusting our performance because we understand audience expectations and we're managing our impressions in front of audiences. So this is who I am in this context with these people is sort of a way to think about it. Individuals who can be stigmatized are aware that if they are labeled as deviant, that it can be that they could be shunned and it could be stigmatized. People may manage that, try to manage an impression. They may try to pass. So if a person has an addiction to opioids, a person has an addiction to methamphetamines or some addiction, they may try to hide that in order to be able to pass as an individual who does not have an addiction. So they're giving a performance, they're trying to manage an impression. Or if other people may become aware that a person has an addiction, then the person's managing that impression of others managing that, person's going through recovery or they're telling their story or trying to manage an impression with other people. Not that they're trying to manipulate or change other people's, like in a cold, calculated way, but it's this idea of people are trying to address this management of a spoiled identity or stigma. Um, I won't go into tertiary deviance. We'll kind of come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so in the chapter 5, Henry goes through a lot of neutralization theories. So these techniques of neutralization, and basically neutralization theory is how do people respond in a way that neutralizes the stigma. It's a vocabulary, a language that people provide that addresses their motives or their reasons for. So these techniques of neutralization, they address both the account making, how do people account for their behavior or for their ideas, as well as the origins, the etiology, the origins of the behavior itself. So how do people give their account? What story do they provide to themselves and to others? So it's important a question to ask is, did neutralization, so a person well, let me go back for a second. So a person has an addiction, better people become aware they have an addiction. What account do people give for that? How do people explain that to other people? And question to ask is, does that neutralization happen before or after other people know that the person has an addiction? Or are both going on, or is it happening in both ways where people are thinking about, neutralization even before other people may be aware that the person has an addiction in this case? So let me kind of repeat that to kind of just to restate it in a different way. This idea of neutralization, and Henry talks about this, that if a person engages in, let's say, a criminal behavior or deviant behavior, sometimes people are thinking about neutralization strategies even before the act of committing the act of deviance or crime, because they're aware of what the audience response may be, and they're thinking about, well, how am I going to respond to that audience response? So this is a process related to neutralization, thinking about how do people use these strategies or how do people tell the story about why they did what they did. Audience, if the audience is doing the questioning or holding someone accountable, honors, respects, or accepts these explanations, the person deviating may not suffer severe consequences. So thinking about this, that, the account that an individual might give, that may buffer some of the severe consequences of the stigma and the label. And this is thinking about its vocabulary of motives. And I really stress in when I teach this class face-to-face that these techniques of neutralization are not techniques of manipulation. I guess they could be, but rather they're ways in which people can maintain a sense of self that they're seeking, and they're managing that stigma, and they're telling a story, they have a vocabulary to speak to the reasons for why they did what they did. And of course, it can get into some pathological kind of things, but it could be just like, have some control over the story that's being told rather than, right, the person and individuals, who are providing the judgment, rather than them having full control over the story. Other people, it's the person who's being assigned that deviant identity or stigma. They want to have some control over or have some influence over the story or share their story now and allow other people to make that judgment. So this idea of remedial work, remedial, so remediation. So taking something that could be viewed as bad or wrong or immoral and make it more acceptable, or at least so that other people can understand it better and that it's viewed as less offensive. So part of these ideas of neutralization is doing remedial work, remediation around that stigma. So researcher Cressy, and looking at embezzlers, that people think about things even before they do it. They're aware of the potential audience response and they're aware of what might happen. So they're thinking about it before, thinking about whether the account will be accepted and then thinking about what account to give. Sometimes a vocabulary of motive allows for what Henry says, deviance to proceed. If people can come up with, or people have a way of being able to explain away their behavior, it can give them more of an opportunity for deviance to proceed because they're managing the potential repercussions. Bandura, a social psychologist, talked about diffusion of responsibility, that sometimes when people can assign it's not my responsibility, and we're in a social group that actually facilitates that, and we dehumanize another group that allows for people to do atrocious things sometimes. Um, Sykes and Matza identified, they're the ones who are the theorists who come up with these different techniques of neutralization. And the issue here is that a person is not inherently deviant, but the deviance requires some response from an audience, some reaction. A person who commits an act of deviance may neutralize those actions so that they no longer cast a moral shadow. I think it's a pretty powerful way of looking at it. People may try to neutralize those things to remove that moral judgment or minimize or manage that moral judgment. Neutralization strategies may be conscious or unconscious. People may be like, I'm gonna, really, really, um, consciously like sit down and think about all these different stories that I could tell, all these different techniques, all these different ways of managing that dilemma or situation where people may be providing that moral judgment, or it could be more unconscious. These strategies assist people in maintaining ideas of self and being able to get to manage impressions with others and manage their identity. Sometimes we could link this into subcultures that, within a subculture environment, your social groups that people belong to may influence people's storytelling and the narratives and the stories that they tell. Their understanding of these techniques, that they may be the hear other people give justifications for their behavior, and they could pick up on and learn, just like learning anything else, they're learning techniques of neutralization. It could be that things that, I don't know, we don't have to go through all these different components. I think that's good enough for now. And then in Henry, in the book, he goes through all these different techniques of neutralization. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but have you define them, explain them in the assignment. Just working through there's 10 of them here. And I think what's important here is that, I mean, you could come up with different language around these. You can come up with different titles of all these. But I think what it speaks to is the complexity to which we are engaged in, individuals are engaged in managing stigma and managing a deviant identity, or that reaction and judgment from others, and that people engage in narrative storytelling in order to manage that deviant status. And there's a lot of different rhetorical strategies or storytelling strategies that may kind of influence that. You could also look these up online somewhere too and get through the list that way. Okay. So that's it for today. Yeah, next week we're kind of coming to that space in the term where we are, stick on one more week of kind of in this more micro level space. And then we're going to get into a lot of applications. So we're almost done with the book. Major theoretical ideas are provided. Now we're going to be moving into some more applications to some different areas. Be safe, be well. Thanks for all of your engagement, involvement, and yeah, have a great week.